And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever more acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. What does it take for us to find our yes? What does it take to move us to action? On the evening of May 25th, 2020, a store clerk suspected that an African-American man named George Floyd may have used a counterfeit $20 bill to make a purchase. The police were called. During Floyd's arrest, a white police officer knelt on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, while 3 fellow officers assisted and bystanders filmed. Floyd complained of breathing difficulties for a while and expressed his fear of imminent death until finally he lay quiet and then still. When an officer finally checked, Floyd didn't have a pulse, but still had an officer's knee on his neck. Bystanders filming the incident tried to advocate for him, not to let him go, but for the officer's knee to be removed from his neck, particularly once Floyd was no longer conscious or responsive. An ambulance finally arrived, and paramedics provided emergency medical care. But it was too late. George Floyd died roughly 1.5 hours after the initial call was made to the police. All 4 police officers present were later convicted of federal charges of violating Floyd's civil rights, and all 4 officers were convicted of various state charges involving manslaughter. Videos of the events that night quickly made their way across the United States and around the world. Stories of African American people being killed by police are plentiful. Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery are just a few of the better known names. There are hundreds, maybe more. The killing of George Floyd, though, didn't just make the news. It ignited a movement. It was the final straw for a populace glued to their screens in the early days of the COVID pandemic and weary, oh so weary of death. It moved thousands of people to action. Protests erupted around the US and throughout the world under the banners Black Lives Matter and Say Their Names. The protests went on for months throughout that summer and beyond. And I think the consciousness of the world shifted in what I hope is lasting and growing ways. Here in Canada, a year after Floyd's murder, on May 27, 2021, the Tecumlip's Tiswetmik issued a press release confirming the discovery of 215 unmarked graves of children who were students of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The basic fact that there were likely unmarked graveyards at residential schools shouldn't really have come as a surprise. Where are the children buried? Is the title of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in concert with the 4th volume of the full and final report titled Missing Children and Unmarked Burials that was released in 2016. 6 of the 94 TRC calls to action, numbers 71 to 76, relate to the children who never went home from residential school and the possible locations of their burials. Beyond the official TRC reports, Indigenous communities have always known. Too many children were taken to residential schools and never went home. They just disappeared, with their families never informed of their death or its cause or otherwise, let alone having their bodies returned or otherwise properly honored and memorialized with something as simple and fundamental as a grave marker. Indigenous communities have always known. And despite all that, many of us, most of us, genuinely didn't know. At least we didn't know until Tecumlip's Tiswetmik released a press statement saying, among other things, we had a knowing in our community that we were able to verify. To our knowledge, these missing children are undocumented deaths, 215 of them. And now we know. And now we know it's a drop in the bucket. We now know that there are thousands out there. A wave of grief and outrage swept across our country. There was something about that number, 215, something about that moment that got our attention in a new way. We had watched Black Lives Matter play out in the US, and now it was and is our moment of racial reckoning. Something about the rawness, the powerlessness that we were all experiencing in year 2 of the global pandemic, maybe. A response to how much all of us were still in front of our screens in those COVID days, perhaps. The ways in which George Floyd's murder and subsequent protests and social movement made us more attentive, more sensitive, more able to hear and absorb the terrible news. I don't know what it was, but I do know that something in our consciousness shifted in what I hope is a lasting and growing way. Many of us were moved to action, to learn histories we didn't know, to connect with Indigenous histories and communities around us, to acknowledge the first inhabitants of this land on which we live and work and pray. We have gradually realized how much more we have yet to do for healing and reconciliation to truly come to pass. And even though we mostly don't really know what to do, even that not knowing feels like a step forward, because at least we know that we don't know. We know that we need to live into our declaration that every child matters. We need to find our next yes. What does it take to move us to action? We all have our own personal stories. We have stories of our community, and today we also have stories of our ancient ancestors. Today we hear about Jonah's response to his second calling from God, because we heard Jonah ran in the other direction the first time, and it took a storm at sea and a sojourn in the belly of a fish to elicit a different response. The people of Nineveh, on the other hand, responded immediately and unreservedly to God's call, moving to immediate action at the faithful preaching of a reluctant prophet. In our gospel story today, it was John's arrest that moved Jesus to action. And whatever it was about their lives, the grinding poverty and exploitation they experienced as fishermen, perhaps, that had Simon, Andrew, James, and John respond immediately to Jesus' simple call, "Follow me." What does it take for us to find our yes to God's call? How much do we need to know? How many questions do we need to ask? What promises or assurances do we need to hear? What do we need to move us to action?